All right, guys. Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Oh, hi, Jess. You're muted.
Sorry, I clicked on the wrong link. I apologize.
No problem. All right, guys. Today we're going to talk about progressivism. Getting into the progressive era in your book. The last 2 weeks we've been focused on chapter 18, sort of the origins of progressivism, talked a lot about uh, American labor and our position on the global or geopolitical spectrum. Talked a lot about the origins of progressivism, which really started in the populist movement. We learned about this sort of the dynamics between Republicans and populists during the election of 1896, and then again in 1900, William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley. Applied that to American imperialism, sort of expanding our economic and hegemonic influence in the Western Hemisphere. And so today we're going to talk about sort of all of this coming into fruition in a loosely defined movement that took place over the first 20 years of the 20th century. So we're basically looking at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, to the end of World War I. Although we'll talk about the progressives and their challenges in the election of 1916 and their sort of tenuous relationship with Woodrow Wilson. All right, let's go over some important characteristics of this era, this 20-year era. We know that this is a time of prominent social division, right? We've talked about economic stratification during the Gilded Age. This continues into the Progressive Era, where we see a major division between the working class and the managerial or ownership class. We see although during the Progressive Era, we're starting to see a larger middle class. There's still incredible stratification between the rich and the poor. Income division or social division is very prominent. At the same time, we see immense economic expansion during the Progressive Era. This is continuing from the Second Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. We see new industries popping up, the creation of new jobs, new demographics challenging the workforce, more reliance on immigrant employment, immigrant labor, but also some disruptions in gender dynamics or gender norms, where we start to see women start to challenge gender norms in the workplace. This is also a time of mass consumerism. During the Progressive Era, we start to see consumerism be added to this concept of American identity. We'll talk about that here in a bit, but basically tying one's liberty or one's identity as an American to the products that they buy or their access to consumer markets. We're going to see how this has an impact on governments and their responsibilities to providing Americans these liberties or redefining what these unalienable rights are. Rapid urban expansion. We see this urbanization continue during the Progressive Era, where we see a continuation of these migration patterns from rural parts of America to urban parts of America, creating very rapidly developing cities, not only in the Northeast, but the Second Industrial Revolution brings big cities into the Midwest, Chicago and Cincinnati and St. Louis and so forth. And also, this is an era of very contentious labor relations. This is where we start to see the foundation of populism start to impact labor relations during the Progressive Era. During the Gilded Age, and especially in the 1890s, populists are working to convince American workers that labor unions and collective bargaining is in their best interest to challenge the authority of this managerial class, right? To challenge the authority of these monopolists and these Gilded Age capitalists. So this idea of social inequality is very important to the progressive movement, right? This idea that the government should be responsible for providing Americans access to upward social mobility, that the government should be responsible for combating social inequality, challenging social inequality, enacting laws and regulations that help Americans access upward social mobility, that combat the social stratification that has led to, because of lack of regulations, horrible working conditions that are very dangerous, that are employing children by the millions in America. Uh, um, Unable to access, or Americans' inability to access upward social mobility because they can't make enough money to buy property. The stratification that the majority of wealth is accumulated by a very small population, the one percenters. So progressives are challenging and saying that the government should be involved in directly combating these social and economic inequalities. And this term progressivism starts to be used during the first decade of the 20th century. So who were these progressives? The book has a pretty good definition of progressivism, describing a broad, loosely defined political movement of individuals and groups who hope to bring about significant change in American social and political life. I liked that definition that Fauner gave because it's largely seen as through the lens of politics, creating change through political agency and through giving the working class a political voice. But it's seeking to change society and politics, to reform America in a more progressive mold. So who are these progressives? Many of them are labor activists, right? We talked about the American Federation of Labor, the Knights of Labor, some of the first events where American labor unions and labor organizers are trying to affect change in society. Female reformists, female agents of reform. We'll talk about the NAWSA and the American Women's Party. Well, or, I'm sorry, National Women's Party. We'll get to that a little bit later. But we'll talk about some very important female reformers in the progressive movement. I also put up sources for two very important female reformers, Margaret Sanger and Jane Addams with the Hull House. So make sure you guys check those out. Social scientists. So this is sort of a new discipline in the 20th century, what we would now call sociology, but it's basically a scientific approach to looking at how societies function and form and how they allocate resources within society and how members of a certain culture or group perform in a certain society. So social sciences, or what we now call sociologists. Forward-looking businessmen who know that this is an unsustainable economic system supported in the United States at the time, which allocates all of the wealth and property to a very small minority. That's an unsustainable system for a healthy capitalist economic or capitalist economy. And also Fauner describes a group that he says are members of an anxious middle class. So during the progressive era, we're starting to see the advent of a middle class, working class Americans that do have limited access to upward social mobility, but fear the power of these huge capitalist corporations or these big businesses that dominate certain industry because they know that they directly threaten their access to upward social mobility. We talked about this with monopolies, right? Using horizontal and vertical integration, they can come to dominate certain industries, which prohibit smaller businesses from growing and being able to compete on an open market. All right, make sure you guys read about the growth of urban and consumer societies. The economic expansion from the Second Industrial Revolution carries over into the progressive era. So there's a lot of money in the economy, and the progressive movement is very much about figuring out how American laborers can get their hands on some of that money, or a more equitable distribution of money or wealth in the United States. We also start to see irrigation move corporate farms further and further west into the Imperial Valley, parts of Arizona, parts of New Mexico that were considered too arid to grow in. We'll see that the New Mexico Territory and eventually statehood comes about during the Progressive Era. And this is really economic expansion into territories that have become economically viable because of irrigation technologies. Make sure you guys understand the muckrakers. We talked about them briefly as sort of a response to yellow journalism. The book gets into a couple of really important, interesting muckrakers. Lewis Hines is a really interesting one. He goes around taking pictures of children in the workforce. He's one of the first to expose the horrendous conditions that children had to work in textile factories in the Carolinas. Taking pictures of hundreds of children who had had their hands amputated by these giant industrial looms. So he's using his medium, photography, to expose Americans to these horrific conditions coming out of the Gilded Age. So in many ways, this is a progressive agenda as well, right? Challenging the authority of these big businesses who are exploiting child labor for their own benefits as a way to support the working class, right? And by the turn of the 20th century, 1 in 6 children under the age of 10 worked full time. 1 in 6. That was only 120 years ago. And if you were a child from 5 to 10 years old, 1 out of 6 of you worked in an actual job. And we've already talked about the horrific industrial accidents that were taking place during the Gilded Age and sort of drawing attention to these unsafe working conditions. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is a great example of that, which you guys will learn about this week and take a quiz on. Ida Tarbell is another important muckraker. She exposes Standard Oil and really sort of casts Standard Oil as the figurehead of these evil capitalist corporations that are really holding down American workers. Many people consider her to be sort of the pioneer of investigative journalism, right? This idea that you use your journalistic investigative skills to expose corruption and expose the truth of these corporate business dealings. A large departure from these sort of sentimental patriotic writings of the yellow journalists, right? And probably the most famous example is Upton Sinclair, who writes a very famous book called The Jungle in 1906. Which basically follows the Scandinavian family trying to access upward social mobility in the meatpacking district in Chicago. And he writes very graphically about how disgusting the conditions are and you know how oppressed these immigrants are, and they're not only exploited for their labor, but they're exploited sexually and they're exploited socially, and it's a very tragic tale. And it actually leads to legislation to try to combat some of these, or to try to regulate some of these industries that Americans are so shocked to find out are so disgusting. He very vividly describes, you know, his work neighbor getting his finger chopped off, and it goes in the meat grinder, and you know, Joe Blow the next day gets a fingernail in his sausage, and just horrible stuff like that. And it directly inspires the Pure Food and Drug Act, which passes regulations forcing the government to inspect meats to make sure that Americans are eating healthy or aren't being subjected to these horrible meatpacking practices. So yeah, make sure you guys understand who the muckrakers were. There's some very easy progressives that you might be able to insert into your paper, because they can really apply to a lot of these progressive ideals of government regulations, protecting the working class, challenging unfair business practices, things of that sort. So keep that in mind when you guys are putting together your thesis. All right, consumerism. We know that's another major part of progressivism or the progressive agenda. We talked briefly about how many, especially social historians, will look at the 19th century, and the great obstacle to freedom in the 19th century is enfranchisement. right? This idea of being able to vote, who is an actual citizen, who's granted these citizenship rights. Well, in the 20th century, we see the focus shift to consumerism, that part of your American identity, part of your intrinsic rights as an American citizen, what we call unalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that part of that is having economic freedom, having access to consumer markets, having a good enough job that you can participate in consumerism, having the government regulate industry and labor to make sure that Americans can buy property, to make sure that Americans can access upward social mobility, to make sure that Americans can participate in consumerism as part of their citizenship. Okay? So that's where consumerism and progressivism really sort of tie together. Access to products, access to modern capitalism, that if we're defining our society as a capitalist democracy, then just as important that we can participate in the democratic process is that we can participate in the capitalist process, right? So that's where progressives really start to demand what would be considered now an American standard of living, right? We talked about Louis Brandeis and this idea of an American standard of living, that Americans should have freedom to vote, they should be freedom of religion, that they should also included in that be able to watch Nickelodeons and buy Levi's and go to vaudeville shows, and that American capitalism tied to consumerism was very much as important an identifying factor as democracy. Any questions on that? I'm not sure I explained that very well. Make sense? Okay, cool. So yeah, this is sort of the advent of leisure activities in American society as well. We see the first amusement parks, we see Nickelodeons, and the advent of popular culture. At the turn of the 20th century, the three most popular sports are boxing, horse racing, and baseball. As the radio becomes more and more prominent in American society, these pastimes, as we would call them, become more and more popular. But that's also a catalyst for American consumerism. The more people that have a radio, the more advertisements they listen to, the more products that they're likely to buy. Your book also goes into Henry Ford as part of this larger process of bringing Americans into mass consumer societies or mass consumer markets. Make sure you guys understand Fordisms, how Ford changed manufacturing to allow average American citizens to be able to buy a car. Prior to the Ford company and the moving assembly line, cars were really a luxury only afforded by capitalists, by the wealthy 1%. Ford realizes that it's in his best interest to manufacture a car that can reach a larger market than these specialty cars that can only be bought by rich people. So he figures out a way to standardize output. He figures out a way to improve the manufacturing process to bring the cost of production down to a point where he can sell his car to more and more Americans. Again, in an odd way, this sort of fits into the progressive model of economic access or access to economic freedom, right? This idea that everybody can participate in buying a car, ironically, comes about because of one of the biggest Gilded Age capitalists, the Ford family, learns how to standardize manufacturing to bring larger masses of American middle class into the consumer process, into buying automobiles. So make sure you guys understand that. Fordisms, his Highland Park plant is very important in that whole process. Also, his labor practices were very progressive in many ways. Ford realizes that it's in the company's best interest to retain their employees because it helps bottom line. If you don't have to continuously train new employees, you have less turnover in your company, then you'll have better production. That in turn gives his employees better wages, better working conditions so that he can retain those employees. So in many ways, Ford fits into this progressive model. On a broader spectrum, we start to see the economy focus on more consumer products rather than capital goods. We talked about during the Gilded Age, the biggest companies are US Steel and Standard Oil and railroad companies. And they come to dominate industries that are focused on capital goods, right? Goods that you need to make other products, commodities you need to make other products. We start to see bigger and bigger companies focus on consumer products during the progressive era, making specific things to fuel this consumer growth. That ties products to American identity. This is all part of the same process, right? Identifying yourself as an American consumer or adding consumerism to your American identity. So at the same time, sort of the advent of modern marketing practices try to tie American consumers, American citizens into these sort of patriotic notions of American identity. I think I mentioned this when we talked about the Second Industrial Revolution, right? Buy Liberty bonds and Freedom soap and things like that, right? So this is the advent of what we would now call the science of marketing. And all of this is sort of redefining what American life should be, right? Progressives argue that American life should be about personal fulfillment, should be about upward social mobility, should be about utilizing the resources given in America, including the government, to grant you access to this upward social mobility. And that's going to have major political ramifications, right? These Gilded Age and post-Civil War Republican dynamics that are tied to economic expansion and this income stratification and laissez-faire economics where the government doesn't touch the market are really falling by the wayside after the turn of the 20th century. Even William McKinley himself is so worried that he's going to lose the election of 1900, he asks Teddy Roosevelt to be his running mate because Teddy Roosevelt is seen as a progressive. So even the Republican Party itself is changing their model to sort of appeal to these larger demographics of progressives. And remember, the populists combined forces with the Democrats in the 1890s to try to challenge this Republican stronghold on the executive. So we're going to see that Republicans start to sort of shift their political philosophies. And then in 1901, William McKinley gets assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. And all of a sudden, the Republican Party is led by a progressive. So in an odd sort of series of events, the Republican Party shifts its platform to adhere more to these progressive ideas. And the first two progressive presidents are both Republican, Teddy and then Taft. And then Wilson comes in and he's kind of a fake progressive. You guys will read all about the progressive presidents in the second half of chapter 18. So everybody understands the political ramifications of progressives basically demanding access to consumerism. Okay. Make sure you guys read about the American standard of living, these concepts of an American wage, a standard wage, what we would now call a minimum wage. That also relates to the government's role in protecting collective bargaining rights. We're going to start to see the government become directly involved in labor unions. They start that in the 1890s with the Granger movement and the Sub-Treasury Plan, but they continue into the progressive era. The New Republic is a progressive newspaper that's very important for disseminating progressive ideas during the Taft administration. Read about Louis Brandeis, the idea of industrial freedom. He also is a champion of the concept of workers' compensation. This idea that the company you work for is responsible for your well-being based on the profits that you make that company. Most of these progressive ideas start to take place on a state-by-state basis before seeking a national either amendment to the Constitution or a national act to support these progressive policies on a national scale. So much like women's suffrage or prohibition, a lot of these labor ideas start on a state-by-state basis before trying to gain a national law or a national amendment. So by 1913, 22 states had enacted some form of workmen's compensation. He also focuses on extending rights to women and children in the workforce. But we're going to see that his goals are sort of surpassed by progressives who want to outlaw child labor altogether. This is also an era of incredible labor strife, incredible labor or contentious labor relations. Out of the 1890s, labor unions get stronger and stronger during the progressive era. The two biggest labor unions are the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which is sort of an umbrella union, largely white, largely male, a very sort of oppressive group if you were a minority or you were one of these marginalized Americans. They had 1.6 million members by 1904, mainly skilled laborers, not really railroad workers or factory workers, or certainly not women or minorities. And then so the IWW, the industrial workers of the world, pops up to serve to cater to the group of Americans that were excluded from the American Federation of Labor. So the IWW is much more progressive. They try to promote themselves to immigrants, to African Americans, factory workers, women, Chinese laborers. I remember the Chinese are specifically being targeted during the 1890s. You'll also read about Eugene Debs. He's one of the founding members of the IWW and one of the most important progressives of the progressive era. He also becomes a big proponent of socialism, which we'll talk about here in a second. He's such a staunch socialist. He is highly critical of the American government. When World War I rolls around, the government passes the Espionage Acts as basically a way to oppress American free speech that could be critical of the government. And Eugene Debs is actually arrested under the Espionage Act. He's imprisoned. Woodrow Wilson refuses to pardon him. He still has a huge following when he's in prison. He ends up running for president in 1920 from prison and gets almost 1 million votes from prison, becomes sort of this sort of cultural icon for socialists and progressives, especially immigrants and these sort of marginalized low-skill laborers. So make sure you guys understand or read about Eugene Debs, understand his position. Louis Brandeis, we already talked about. It goes through a few strikes and walkouts, a few important ones of the progressive era. If you guys want to focus on labor and labor actions, strikes, and so forth, I would look into the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike at the Lawrence Wool Mill in 1912. And then sort of a good counterpart to that is the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado. Shows sort of different approaches to handling these strikes and walkouts. One's in Massachusetts, really in the public view, and it's successful. They use the IWW and socialist networks to help strengthen their position against the wool factory, the wool mill. And the other, the Ludlow massacres in Colorado, sort of out of the purview of the American public. And because of that, because people aren't paying as close attention to Ludlow, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company basically threatens and intimidates the workers in the Ludlow mill until they break their strike. They drive through their camps with machine guns mounted to cars, threatening them. They kick them out of dormitories so they don't have anywhere to live. It's an interesting example of the lack of regulation or lack of government authority and lack of attention paid by American society led this company to, which was actually owned by John Rockefeller, by the way, to horribly mistreat these strikers, physically intimidate them, light their tent cities on fire, horrible events. And it results in the strikers basically giving up. All right, make sure you guys understand or read about these progressive women. You've got two sources this week, one on Margaret Sanger and one on Jane Addams. Jane Addams is an incredible woman, maybe the most prominent progressive reformer of either gender during the progressive era, inspired future progressive women to continue to carry on the movement. She worked in the Hull House, or created Hull House, which are basically amnesty or settlement houses in Chicago, and helped immigrants find jobs, helped women get out of abusive relationships, participate in community building practices, a lot of great things for marginalized communities in Chicago. By the middle of the progressive movement, there are hundreds of these settlement houses, amnesty houses across the country, all inspired by Jane Addams' Hull House movement. She also inspires other women. Florence Kelley actually worked or is a product of the Hull House. She goes on to create the National Consumers League, which is very important because it brings these ideas of consumerism and gives women agency through these consumer practices. So basically what Florence Kelley is promoting is that women become socially conscious consumers. That even though women don't have political agency, they can't vote on national elections, they have agency, they have power in how they spend their household budgets. So she challenges women become a socially conscious consumer, only support companies that don't employ children, only support companies that have normal working hours and that support collective bargaining, that allow unions, etc. So not only does Jane Addams directly help thousands of women and marginalized Americans, but she goes on to inspire other female reformers who will have a significant impact on the progressive movement. Look into the Margaret Sanger, little short Margaret Sanger documentary. Her and Emma Goldman are very involved in the birth control movement. This is not only about, this isn't the pill we're talking about. This is basically teaching women about reproductive processes, how women can take control of their reproductive process, how they can have sexual agency in a family. They tour the country lecturing on sex education and even some very progressive ideas. Emma Goldman challenges society to accept homosexuality throughout the first decade of the 20th century, which is incredibly progressive. Emma Goldman is a bit more of a radical than Margaret Sanger. She is a very avid supporter of workers' rights, and women's rights, but she takes it to another level and says basically that we should have an anarchist society. We should completely dismantle the government, that the government are agents of oppression. She gives lectures about overthrowing the government. And actually, Leon Solzgul, the guy that kills William McKinley, had just come from an Emma Goldman lecture and then murders the president. So she's a very radical woman. And Margaret Sanger was seen as a radical woman as well, but all she was trying to do was teach women that they have reproductive agency. She came from a family with 11 kids, I believe, an Irish immigrant family, and she realized her family couldn't access upward social mobility because they were poor, because they couldn't stop having kids. So she, challenges the Pope for saying you can't use contraception. She challenges women to take agency and say that I'm not just here to have babies for my husband. So because of that, she's seen as a radical, but she's certainly doesn't have radical ideology or support radical ideologies like Emma Goldman. Unfortunately, she's thrown in prison for saying vagina in public. She's, basically chastised and pursued by the government for daring to talk about sex in public. All right. Then the second half of the chapter gets into the politics, progressive politics. look at state progressive agendas. Like I said, a lot of these progressive agendas start on the state level before they gain national attention. Enfranchisement is a big one for that. Female enfranchisement. It really takes place on a state-by-state basis before challenging the federal government to pass the 19th Amendment. Spoiler alert, women get the right to vote in 1920. So these progressive agendas often take place on a state-by-state basis. We also see that different areas of the country are more susceptible to these progressive agendas. Some of the first states to allow women to vote are in the West, Idaho and Wyoming and Colorado and so forth. So we start to see that the West becomes a much more, or sort of a hub for these progressive ideals. We see some goals to reform the political process on a national level as well. Let's see. The 17th Amendment, that's a very important progressive agenda. The 17th Amendment will allow for senators to be directly elected by the people. Again, this is a progressive ideal to give more agency to the people over political agencies. So prior to the 17th Amendment, members of the House of Representatives elected and appointed members of the Senate. Well, the 17th Amendment would dictate that citizens of a state could directly elect their senators. So that's an expansion of democracy. Keep in mind that progressives support expansions of democracy, granting women the right to vote, more direct influence on who represents them in Congress, etc. The use of primary elections is widely adopted. This is another expansion of democracy, right? Now individuals have a say in who represents their particular political party, rather than a party appointing candidates that will run for that party. Now American citizens can participate in primary elections, which allows them to pick their candidate for their political party. Unfortunately, in the South, this was also a way to restrict democracy, as we start to see the advent of what are called white primaries, where in the South, they agree to hold primary elections, but they deny African Americans the right to vote in those primary elections. So an African American might be able to vote in a general election, but if his or her candidate or his candidate isn't chosen, or he can't choose the candidate to represent him, he still has very limited political agency. All right, so those are expansions of democracy, right? The 17th Amendment, popular election of judges, use of primary elections, and the biggest expansion of democracy in the history of the country is allowing women or granting women the right to vote. There's also, unfortunately, restrictions to the democratic process during the Progressive era. The systematic disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South through Jim Crow laws continues through the Progressive era. Literacy tests being employed. Also, the advent of political bosses, or the continuation of these political bosses, is another restriction of democracy. So not all progressive goals were accomplished, right? All right, look into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the biggest women's suffrage association of the turn of the 20th century. By 1917, by the time we get into World War I, there's over 2 million members. Like I said, by the turn of the 20th century, we see states like Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Idaho adopt some form of suffrage for women. But then as we get into World War I, we're going to start to see progressive women challenging the government to adopt an amendment to the Constitution, specifically challenging Woodrow Wilson. We'll read about the National Women's Party in the next chapter. And then we get into progressive presidents. So there's three progressive presidents: Teddy, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt, we know, assumes the office of the presidency after William McKinley gets assassinated. He's a national celebrity for his involvement in the Spanish-American War, being part of the Rough Riders. We've talked about how he sort of redefines American identity in his own right. There's a great book on American masculinity and imperialism that focuses on American masculine identity and its role in leading us into these imperial tactics or agendas. He wants to establish the United States as the preeminent policing power of the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary is very much designed to establish us as the preeminent power in these geopolitical dynamics in the Western Hemisphere. Read about the Square Deal. This is the first time Americans see that Roosevelt isn't going to adhere to these old Republican dynamics that are very anti-union, very pro-capitalist, very pro-business. When he negotiates a coal mining strike in Pennsylvania, he basically says that the government will take over the mine and nationalize the company if they don't give their workers equitable rights. So he basically, out of this negotiation, he comes up with a slogan for his administration that he calls the Square Deal. His fifth cousin, 30 years later, will take this and turn and come up with his own slogan during another economic crisis that he calls the New Deal, right? Franklin Roosevelt, 30 years later. So the Square Deal is about controlling corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving the environment. He adds a layer, another sort of layer to this progressive agenda, which is about environmental conservation. Teddy is a great environmentalist himself. He loves to camp and go on these crazy expeditions. When he loses the nomination in 1912, he goes to the Amazon. And he's, this sort of adds to the folklore of this sort of the prestige of Teddy Roosevelt. So the Square Deal very much represents the progressive agenda, labor, the interests of labor over the interests of management, the interests of consumers over the interests of big business, the interests of the American public over the interests of developers that are trying to go into new territories and strip the land for natural resources, oil, lumber, etc. He's also the first to implement the Sherman Antitrust Act that we talked about. Was passed in 1890, but really didn't have any teeth, couldn't be used yet. He goes after certain corporations that he deems as bad for American society. Goes after Northern Securities, which is basically a shell corporation to fund railroad companies. Decides that they're bad for American society, bad for America's economy, so he goes after them. But unfortunately, he has some very powerful friends, so he doesn't go after some pretty monopolistic companies like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. He's friends with these capitalists, and so sort of picks and chooses which companies he decides are bad and he's going to go after. He's an egotist, certainly, so that influences his impact on busting up these monopolies. And it's actually his predecessor, William Howard Taft, who many see as a more traditional Republican, but utilizes the Sherman Antitrust Act and really starts to go after these trusts and monopolies and break them up. He's the real trust buster. He handpicks his successor, William Howard Taft. He thinks that Taft will continue his agenda until his ego gets to him in 1912 and he decides to run again against Taft, starting his own political party called the Bull Moose Party, which basically destroys the Republicans' chance of winning in 1912 and gives the election to Woodrow Wilson. All right, a few accomplishments that Roosevelt was able to, a few things Roosevelt was able to accomplish. The Panama Canal, read about that. That's a big part of our imperial agenda. We now control the canal, which allows transport of goods to the west coast of South and North America. Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in revenue over the history of our occupation of Panama. he basically supports a Panamanian revolution. He sends the American Navy down to Colombia, who is Colombia and Panama are together at the time, points our guns at Colombia and says, Panama is going to be independent now. They don't want to get into a war, so they say, okay, gives us access to go in and dig the Panama Canal. Very interesting story, very interesting history in the Panama Canal with the French and now the Americans. Anyway, read about that. That supports our imperial agenda abroad. He passes the Hepburn Act in 1906. That's an important progressive accomplishment. It strengthens the ICC. Remember, the ICC was another reform, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was supposed to regulate the train industry, but really didn't have any teeth until the Hepburn Act was passed, which allowed the government to set transportation rates. It allowed them to examine their business records to make sure they weren't giving unfair pricing to certain corporations, et cetera. And remember, that's a huge agenda of the populace and now progressives is to combat the power of the railroads. Well, we don't need to get into that. Look into his conservation tactics. Yellowstone becomes the first national park. It's first designated right after the Civil War, but then he strengthens the designation with the National Parks Act. Out of that, we get Yosemite and Glacier. Eventually, that's strengthened again in the 1940s and then again in the 1960s, creating national parks and wilderness areas. Eventually, under the Johnson administration, that's how we get a lot of our wilderness in New Mexico. And yeah, he's the first to challenge these corporations and say that these territories should be saved for the American public rather than stripped of their resources by special interest groups or by these corporations. All right, so then he handpicks. You also need to look into these quote unquote banana republics that are rising during the progressive era. We talked about this during populism, or talked about this during American imperialism. It's a form of economic imperialism where American companies go into foreign countries, dominate their only exportable resource, which makes them the most powerful entity in the country. Then they start to influence politics in the country. They put in their own politicians to make sure they pass laws that only support these American companies. The most egregious example is a company called the UFC, the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita Banana, which is widely seen as one of the most evil corporations of all time. So enjoy that next time you're eating a Chiquita Banana. But it's they're an interesting example of coming into these smaller countries in Costa Rica and Guatemala and Honduras, dominating their only exportable resources, forcing them to work for pennies a day to raise profits of these American corporations, dominating local politics so they can't pass any laws against American corporations, creating what are known as banana republics, right? All right, so then comes Taft, more conservative than Roosevelt. However, he pursues antitrust more aggressively than Roosevelt. Make sure you understand dollar diplomacy. This idea that he thinks the best way to spread American influence is through economic expansion, economic imperialism. This leads to the rise of banana republics. There's also an interesting story about the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot and John Muir. Make sure you look into that. Again, I'm not sure how much these tie into progressivism in general. And then we get to Woodrow Wilson. He sort of goes back on dollar diplomacy, wants to spread American democracy. He thinks that that will eventually aid American businesses after we spread democracy. Some more progressive accomplishments, the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The 16th Amendment, which is about direct taxation. And then another aspect of progressivism that we didn't really get a chance to talk about was the temperance or prohibition movement. This again started on a state-by-state basis, prohibiting the sale, distribution, and manufacturing of alcohol as a way to try to improve society. And eventually it reaches national prominence when the 18th Amendment is passed, which is a national amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol. We'll really get into that when we get into the 1920s, but it's a progressive agenda that's accomplished by 1920, even though it turns out to be a horrible disaster and leads to the rise of organized crime and so on and so forth. But it is a progressive agenda. So if you're arguing that progressivism didn't work, that might be a good one to look at. All right. We got about 2 or 3 minutes. Progressivism in a nutshell. Questions for me?
I had one. I don't remember seeing about the banana republics in chapter 18.
Oh, really? I might have jumped ahead a little bit. I was going off of my old classroom lectures more so than the chapter.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember seeing that. And the Panama Canal, I don't know that it was mentioned in chapter 18, unless I somehow missed that.
Yeah, you're right. Panama Canal is in chapter 19.
Okay. Is that where they talk?
Even though chapter 19 is supposed to be 1916 through 1920, which is a bit weird because Panama Canal was taken under the Roosevelt administration. So yeah, the Roosevelt corollary, a lot of this moral imperialism or dollar diplomacy, liberal internationalism. Yeah, a lot of that'll be covered in the next chapter.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I just wanted you guys to understand how it was related to progressivism.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
You're right, though. That's not going to really apply to your essay this week, unless you take a imperialist approach to progressivism, which would be pretty hard to defend. Okay, guys. So keep in mind, I'm happy to Isaac. What do you got?
Yes, I'm sorry, Professor. When it comes to writing the essay, I've been struggling with, would you like citations from quotes in the book? Or because I don't want to be accidentally plagiarizing by saying what they do, because my memory can be a steel trap and remember their quote. And so I don't want to be taking it from them and saying, well, I said this, so I'm trying to give credit. But
okay, yeah, that's a great question. So if you do use the book directly, you don't need to give me a formal citation in Chicago style or anything. Just put it in quotations and mention Fauner says on page, 709, this, and this, and then you can use a direct quotation. Or the source said this about Margaret Sanger, and then you can use a direct quotation. But also keep in mind, we really don't want to reread quotes from the book, right? Jess and I have read this book several times, and we keep going over it, looking for you guys directly citing things. So we want your interpretation, basically. So try not to rely too much on direct quotes. That goes for all assignments throughout the semester.
Thank you. I've been struggling with that, and I'm like, oh,
I understand. I know. And to be honest, I'm a little more severe and aggressive on looking for plagiarism the first few weeks of the semester, because I really want to hammer that home and make sure you guys aren't just taking quotes out of the book. But I'm sure I scared y'all a little bit with all of our comments on your plagiarism and so forth. So just keep it in mind and make sure that if you do use a direct quote, you put it in quotations. But we don't need formal citations or anything for these.
Okay, wonderful.
Alex, do you have a question?
Yes, we're going to be doing the this week's essay just based on this week's lecture, or we're going to use the whole chapter?
The whole chapter, the lecture. You probably want to include some stuff on populism from prior to this week. The foundations of progressivism, the foundations of, labor advocacy and unequal distribution of wealth and challenging monopolies in the railroads. And so, yeah, basically, doesn't just need to be this chapter, doesn't just need to be this lecture, but how the story of America up to this point led to progressivism.
Okay, I'm gonna have to add to my paper. I already wrote it just in this week, so I'm gonna have to expand. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Last week's.
Cool. So keep in mind, guys, by 5 p.m. today, if you want to get extra credit for your thesis, send me those by 5 p.m. today, or Jess, depending on which class you're in. We'll help with as many as we can. But if we don't get to all of them, we'll try. Shoot us an email over the next couple of days, and even if you didn't turn it in for extra credit, I'll take a look at your thesis to make sure you're on the right track.
Thank you, Professor.
Is there a word count limit or a page requirement
No,
or just get the
so
information in that to
yeah,
support this?
as long as you support your thesis, you'll be good to go. You know, for an essay this size, give me 3 or 4 reasons and a paragraph for each of the reasons that support your opinion, and you'll be good to go.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Originally, this was supposed to be a timed essay, but you know, since I give you guys the prompt ahead of time, I suspect the majority of you will write it out in a Word document and then transpose it to the Blackboard page. I'm fine with that. You know, it lets you prepare before time. But yeah, we don't need any formal citations or anything. All right, guys, I got another review to get to. Any last minute questions?
Can I mention something really quick?
Sure.
I'm going to be on Zoom here. Well, now I should be with another student. So if you guys want to drop by, I'll post the link on the Blackboard on announcements if you guys want to, because I'm now going into my office hours.
Or even better, Jessica, just put the link in the chat here.
Okay. I don't know if I can go that fast. Hold on, wait, I'm just joking. Hold on. There you go. Everybody got that?
Cool.
Yes, you.
So yeah, hop over there if you want to talk to Jess. Keep in mind, she's going to be grading the majority of your essays. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank Jess.
See you. Thank you.
See you guys. See y'all next week.
I have one last question.
Okay, real quick.
Is there a source quiz this week, or is it just the readings?
There's a quiz on the chapter and the sources. So
Okay.
watch the Margaret Sanger and the Jane Addams source. Read and watch those two. Read the second half of the book, and the chapter quiz covers all of it.
Oh, so it's included to the chapter quiz.
I'm sorry?
Is it included in the chapter quiz? Because I wasn't able to find a separate one.
Yeah. So that's only worth 10 points. The majority of your grade this week, 40 points, comes from your essay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.